So the basics, what is a user story? So one thing to keep in mind is a user story is just a tool. That's all it is. And it's a tool to capture a description of a feature from the end user perspective. So it's very important to keep in mind not to get too overly technical with the user story. It should be something written from the point of view of the person who's going to benefit from your work that you're doing. And there are a few components that you want in your user story. There's the title. This is usually like that line that you see in Jira right at the top. So right after like the few letters, dash, and then the numbers, which is like the user story number or issue number or whatever it's called. You have the user story title. So there should be a short phrase or a short sentence, something basic, just describing what the story is about. And you want the who. So, and this is one example of how user stories are written because it's easy to not forget the different aspects of a good user story. So the who, what, and why, you can write it however you want. You can say, as a user of this app, I want to be able to pay my balance so that I don't get any late fees. That's just one way to do it. You can also just write it, bullet point it out, who, the user, why, this goal, what. As long as you just have those three aspects, and it should be fairly consistent from story to story within your squad. However you guys decide to do it, it should be consistent so anyone else on the team who picks up the story and looks at it knows what they're looking at. And notice there's no how in the user story. So you're not looking for a solution here. You're purely looking for who, what, why. It should be like a short paragraph, one sentence. This is your story. But where do you put the how? When you start discussing like, this is how we think this is going to go. And when you're in refinement and you're thinking like, no, this is the solution we're going to go with. Those you can either list further down in the description of the user story if you're using Jira, or you can add them as subtasks or whatever. They just do not belong in the user story description of like who, what, and why. So is that clear to everybody? Any questions on that one? And
Kelly, I would have a question because I just recently looked at user stories again, and my question would be around the who. So since there you have written down user role, right? You usually put a role there. But I also recently heard something about personas. Have you heard of this term personas? So can you maybe elaborate on that? What kind of things is preferable? Yeah.
Yep. And the who can be the user role. It can be a persona. It can be like whoever is the end user. So sometimes that's, as a mortgage customer, or as a credit card user, or as a George user, or anything like that. So whoever the group of people are who are going to be able to use your feature, that would be your use. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a role. It's just kind of like the person sitting there who would be using your feature that you're building. Who is that person? And it's probably more appropriate to even call it a persona than a role. So yeah, maybe user stories need to have a little update. Instead of calling it a user role, we can call it persona.
Okay, can I also have a question?
Sure.
I'm completely new into this stuff, so my question is, who is actually writing these stories? Who is responsible, for gathering data and writing these stories?
Technically, anyone can write a user story, and then the team who's going to actually be taking that story and putting it into their backlog, the whole team is responsible for refining that story and making sure that it's understandable by everybody. So for the most part, they come from, the business side, or the country peers or whatever will ask a team or a product owner, can we have this feature? And then it's usually the product owner who will take it and kind of refine it as much as they can with the country peers or with the business or whoever is requesting the feature, and then they'll refine it with the team. And then the team will ask questions. And so this story, the words could change a little bit. And especially when you start talking about the why, that can lead to a lot of questions from the team as far as how they're going to implement this feature. So it can be written by anyone, but it's the entire team's responsibility to make sure it's written well enough for everyone to understand what you need to do.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Kelly, I also wanted to expand a bit on the question from Klaus. Generally, our stories are written like as a George user because up until now, a George user is kind of has, I don't know, you can do anything as a George user. In the future, however, as we expand into business, I can imagine we will have kind of two types of users, right?
As an individual George user or as a corporate board George user or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And any thoughts in this direction?
Yep. I would stick to being as specific as you can about the user role, but not more specific than you need to be. So like if a feature would behave differently depending on if you're an individual George user versus a business George user, then I would do two separate stories for them. So like as an individual George user, I want to blah, 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 so that. And then as a business George user, I want so that blah, blah, blah. That's typically the best way to do it if they would be operating differently. If they're not operating differently, then it may be a conversation with the team that you have like, hey, is this a story that's so big that to try to implement both solutions in one sprint is too much work? Should we split it into two different ones? And yeah, which is where the refining comes in. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Good. Any more questions on this one? Okay. Acceptance criteria. This is something that is most often forgotten about. And you basically want to have this set before you start working on the story, because you want to know, did we build the product right, and did we build the right product, and did we build it right? So how do you know that unless you have clear acceptance criteria of saying exactly what needs to be built? So there's kind of a checklist of things to keep in mind. With the acceptance criteria, it should be written prior to any development work. Of course, details are going to come out as you're working on the story. So as you're doing development or as you're testing, you're going to find more things and say, oh no, we forgot about this, and then they can be added. But you should have a good list of acceptance criteria before you get started. And the acceptance criteria should be a set of statements with a clear pass-fail result. So you should be able to look at it when the story is done and say, okay, did this happen? Yes or no? And if it's no, then the story is not done. Right? If it's okay, when I click on here, then I click on here, then this happens. If that's not happening, then the story's not done and the acceptance criteria hasn't been met. So it shouldn't be anything vague or unclear. You should be able to easily look and see, is this done or not? And that will make your life much easier. And again, this should state intent, not a solution. So remember from the previous slide, the how you're going to implement this story is nowhere in the user story or acceptance criteria. It belongs either as subtasks or as attachments or additional notes, a reference to a Confluence page, however you want to do it. But when you put it in writing, in the story, in the acceptance criteria, then that leaves you very little wiggle room, because I'm sure any of you who have been doing IT long enough, you think you have a solution and you start working and realize we can't do it this way, we have to do it another way. And if it's already written in the acceptance criteria, this is the way it has to be done, then you have to, go back and change the story, and, it becomes a lot bigger nightmare instead of just saying, look, this is what needs to be done. get it done in the best way possible. And then that gives you some freedom to say, okay, well, I thought we were going to do it this way, but that's not possible the way we thought we could do it. So I'm going to change it and do it this other way. The story is still going to be done. And then if there's any issues with that, that's what the review is for. And then you can create a new story and so on. Okay, and it defines when the work is complete and the product is working as expected. So remember I stated before that if you have stories that you are seeing go from sprint to sprint to sprint without being completed, a lot of times that's a lack of good acceptance criteria because people don't know when they're done. They think, okay, this feature is done. I think I'm done, but there's a few more things I need to do. I wasn't sure if this was included, so I went ahead and kept working on it. It should not be that way. If you have clear acceptance criteria, this is what's included, this is what is not included. So that clear pass-fail result could also be, okay, these are things that are not included in this. So if you have some huge epic that you're working on, sometimes it's necessary to say, okay, this is the feature we're working on, this is what needs to be included. These things are not included in this feature yet. These will be included later on, or that's coming, at a later date or in another story. It's fine. And so that way, people that are testing and the people that are developing, that it's not included. And they specify functional and non-functional requirements. And I'll say that the non-functional requirements, there's a little caveat to this because the non-functional requirements that would be in a story would be things that your particular team can test. So like the non-functional requirements would be like speed, accessibility, security, information, things like that. Like those would be something system-wide, and those should not be in your acceptance criteria because your team, unless you are the team that tests that, those types of requirements wouldn't belong in a user story. The only things that should be included in a user story are things that your team itself can test. And that helps you to prevent the situation where you're done and you're waiting for the other team to do their part, but you can't complete the story because it's not finished yet. So when you have an instance like that, like, hey, we're working on this story and we think it may affect, accessibility for the site, you can create a separate task, not a subtask within the story, but a separate task in your backlog to remind yourself or remind the team, hey, when we're done with this, we need to ask this other team that testing that they need to run a check on accessibility or whatever it happens to be. So user story acceptance criteria can specify functional and non-functional requirements. Just be certain that you're specifying requirements that you yourself can test. Good acceptance criteria are written so that testers can easily just take them and translate them into automated test cases. So this is really important while you're refining stories, to get your testers involved and talk with developers and analysts and make sure everybody understands not only what needs to be developed, but what needs to be tested. And if your acceptance criteria is written really well, that should be something really easy for a tester to take and make automated test cases. And one of the ways to write acceptance criteria is the given, when, then. So given some situation, when this happens, then this happens. So given I have gone to George and entered in my login information and password, when I click on my accounts, then I am able to see the balances of all my accounts. So that's something really easy that a tester can take and make an automated test case out of it. No problem. Good. Any questions on this one? And this is kind of like BDD. So if you're using BDD, this kind of stuff, it just goes right into your user story. Any questions on this?
Just for the people who don't know what BDD stands for, maybe you can elaborate on that?
Yes, behavior driven. So this is written basically from the standpoint of the user. It kind of forces you, and I'm not the pro on BDD for sure, so if someone knows better, feel free to chime in. But it kind of faces the team, it forces the team to think from the point of view of the user. You're thinking of like, how does our customer behave, right? Go ahead. You probably can explain it much better than me.
So, yeah, BDD is a practice that takes a whole team, so that's really nice, and it has 3 steps to it. Mm-hmm. The discovery part, the formulation part, and the test automation. So, to be honest, yeah, this is all I could think of when I heard the steps that you're going through. Mm-hmm. Just BDD, as we practice BDD in our squad in user relations.
Yep, it is. BDD is actually fantastic because and it works really well with writing good user stories, because when you're done with kind of your whatever you call your sessions, like deliberate discovery or your BDD sessions or whatever you call it, where the whole team comes together and talks about you know, how the customer behaves and how we're going to formulate this, and you come up with different scenarios. Those scenarios can be used as acceptance criteria. So it's kind of perfect. And for anyone who's not that familiar with BDD, definitely look into it. It's not complicated, but it's super useful and it's a lot of information. But as soon as you just start kind of using it and doing it, it becomes more familiar. And then you wonder, like, why weren't we doing this all along? That makes so much sense. Okay, so how do we know when a user story is written and ready to be pulled into a sprint? You have the 3 C's. So the card is the first thing. So typically these were written on like index cards or post-it notes. We enter them typically here in Jira. So however you want to document your user story, that's basically the card. So whether you do use post-it notes or entering it in Jira or whatever, it's basically documented somewhere. The second C is conversation. So we typically call this refinement. This is the conversation. It typically comes from, you know, maybe the product owner is talking with the person requesting the feature, and then the conversation needs to happen with the team so everyone has the same understanding of what's going to happen, what needs to happen for the story to be completed. And then you have the confirmation, which is usually the kind of final nail in the coffin is the So once you've had a refinement, the team has come up with good acceptance criteria, the story is written well, finally you can do an estimate. And if the whole team is able to come to an agreement on an estimate, then you have a pretty good idea that the entire team understands exactly what's required for the story to be done. So however that confirmation happens, for most teams, it would be the estimate. The other thing that we want to keep in mind with the invest criteria is these are things that you should keep in mind when you're writing the story. So before I start going through the invest criteria, I will preface all of this by saying these are things to keep in mind. They're not hard and fast rules. It's not like if you're missing one of them, you can't do the story, but they should be things in the back of your mind as you're refining the story and writing it and writing acceptance criteria and figuring out, you know, what tests are going to be run. These are things that you should have in your mind. So we all know stories should be independent. So when you're writing a story, if you're seeing dependencies, you should do whatever you can to remove those dependencies, if at all possible. Of course, I live in the same real world you guys do, so I know that's not always possible, but every effort should be made to try to have the stories independent. If you can't, if it's not possible, or if it's just going to be so absolutely time consuming to try to remove the dependency, just make sure the entire team is aware of that dependency and put it in Jira so that anyone else looking at your stories also knows that you are also aware of that dependency. And the N is that it's negotiable. So negotiable basically means, like, remember I was saying you don't put the solution or how you're going to implement it into the story. So that's kind of the negotiable part. You have a story which is telling you what. This is what you're going to be building, for who, and why you're building it. The how is the negotiable part. How you get it done is totally up to you. So solution should not be written in the story. It should be valuable. You should be delivering something of value to the end user. So that value may be saving money. It could be making their life easier. There's a lot of different ways to determine its value. So in order for the story to be written, there's no hard and fast rule about how you determine the value of a user story. There are a lot of different ideas out there, but I just say that it needs to have some kind of value for why you're making this feature. And then it should be estimable. So the team should be able to have some idea of the size of the story, right? Even if you don't do estimates, even if your team doesn't do estimates right now, if they had to say this is small, medium, and large, just if your team has never done estimates before and they're refining a story, and at the very end, you should be able to say, okay, you guys, compared to everything else in the backlog, do you think this story is small, medium, or large compared to everything else? And if somebody says small and someone says large, there's probably still some discrepancy and some questions that need to be answered about that story before you move forward. And it should be small. So the rule is that it should be completed in one sprint or less. So anywhere between a few days to one sprint, stories should be small enough that the team believes that they can complete it in one sprint. I know that's not always possible, but every effort should be made. So if there's a story where it's like, man, okay, we know we're not going to be able to get this finished in one sprint, but the team, we really have been trying to figure out how to break this into something smaller, and there really isn't, a smart way to split the story, then okay, move on. But at least you've tried. At least this was in your mind. Hey, we don't think we're going to get this done in one sprint. Let's have the conversation. Let's talk with each other and try to figure out, is there a way to split it? Is there a way to, make two different stories? Is there a way to kind of pare down the scope of this feature to make it fit into one sprint and add the rest of the things later, or whatever? So again, we live in the real world. So these are just things that you need to keep in mind for a story. They should also be testable. How do you know if a story is done unless you can test to see that it's done? That makes sense. Now we're going to have a little bit of fun with a quiz, a short quiz. So let's get some feedback. True or false? Everything in a sprint is written as a story. What do you guys think? Is this true or false? Correct. User stories are just one type of item in the backlog. There's also bugs and tasks and spikes, and I should also mention that user stories are just one type of story. So there are user stories, spike stories, business stories. I'm not thinking of them, the rest of them, but yeah, user stories are one item in the backlog. So when we're thinking of like tasks, so that could be something like we were talking about, system-wide non-functional requirements. Making sure, if some other team has to do something, that can just be a task that is assigned to someone and it gets done. It doesn't have you don't have to worry about writing it as a user story and coming up with acceptance criteria and all of that stuff. Good. Technology slices do not produce a deliverable for the end user. True or false? So technology slices are like we did a front end story and this is the back end story. True. The front end must plug into the back end to add value. Vertical slices of functionality are preferred to horizontal text slices because they're potentially shippable. And sushi is always a good example of this, right? So if you're slicing horizontally, the top layer is just going to be some seaweed paper and rice. Is that something valuable to the customer? No. The same as if you're slicing by technology layer, and I know we do that here. I know it's something that we should not be doing. And again, this talk is about how things should be. So if you say, okay, well, we did the back end part, and so the story is done, me as a customer, what do I get out of that? Nothing without the front end. And vice versa. If the front end is done, but the back end work hasn't been done yet, then as a user, I don't have anything valuable yet. So stories should have the whole package. They should be sliced small enough that front end, back end, whatever other elements need to come into place in order for that story to be done is completed in one story. So remember that not everything in a sprint has to be a story. So if you're finding things like that where, you know, we want to do this little thing and test this out, and that's a task, right? If you would have a hard time taking what you want to do and translating it into a user story, it's most likely a task. So back end stuff is a perfect example. Something typically that would be in the back end, if you do the story, if you do it as a story and you deliver it, it typically has no value to the end user, right? And you would usually have a hard time wording it in such a way that it would make sense from an end user perspective. So it probably should be a task. And let's not be confused. I know that there's some teams get confused about, well, how come my stuff is only a task and the other stuff is a story? It doesn't mean the task is not important or anything like that. It just means like it's not delivering something of value for the customer. Maybe not yet. If it's something you want to test out and show the customer and see, then it's a task. Then if it becomes something like, oh, the customer said that's fantastic, we want to do it, then that work would become part of the story. That would be something that would be delivered of value to the customer. Acceptance criteria are optional. A story must have a clear outcome. How else do you know it's done? Right? If you have no acceptance criteria and you just, even if it's a well-written user story, how easily could a tester take that story and translate it into automated test cases? If you don't have good acceptance criteria, you're not helping anybody out by leaving out acceptance criteria. Good. The product owner is the user in the story. Right. The user, remember, it should be the end user. So that, again, and that could be the persona or role or type of user. So it could be, you know, a George user, a mortgage customer, a car loan customer, an admin person, whatever. But always think of it as like, who's benefiting from the work that I'm going to be doing and why do they want it? Good. Acceptance criteria should specify functionality, not aesthetics. True. Generally, acceptance criteria shouldn't get into details about visuals. It should explain what it does, not how it looks. And the reason for that is, where does it end, right? If you start describing how something looks, where do you stop? Like if you were to describe this little adorable squirrel eating some Nutella, how would you describe that accurately enough that someone could actually make that? So like you'd have to say, oh, there's a little piece of a weed growing in front of the squirrel. The squirrel is brown with a little white belly and black eyes, and it's like a medium-sized jar of Nutella and blah, blah, blah. Whereas you could just attach something and the acceptance criteria could just be, you know, it resembles the attachment seen in Jira or the attachment in Confluence or whatever. So don't get into like, it needs to be certain colors or it needs to do any of that. It's just acceptance criteria is just, how does it work? System-wide non-functional requirements that affect users are part of the user story. True or false? False. So I touched on this a little bit. So user stories can have non-functional as long as they are non-functional requirements that the team itself can test, right? So if it's something like it requires the entire system testing and it's maybe some other team that does it, like the, I don't know, regression test team or something like that, then it would not be part of the user story. If it's something where what you're working on you think may affect either like security or availability or accessibility or something like that, and the other team or other squad needs to test it, then I would communicate that with the other team and like create a task for yourself in order to ask that other team to test it, like after the story is completed. But anything that's written in the story as acceptance criteria should be able to be tested by your team and not somebody external. That way you prevent yourself from not being able to complete stories because, you know, the other team is really busy, they have a backlog or whatever. Good. Okay, true or false? A user story only needs the who and the what. False. The why is probably one of the most important things to understand. So understanding why is going to help the developers and the testers and the analysts figure out how to make it work. Right? And the why could include, like, I don't know, user research and whatever, but like, why are you building it? And this also helps the product owner to be able to prioritize. The backlog is knowing why you're implementing each feature. True or false? User stories should specify the appropriate level of information. One of my favorite sayings is that a user story should contain as much information that you need, but not more. So like, don't get into like expressing every single little tiny detail that needs to get in there, because if you've missed something, you can always create a new story and that's something else to add in there, right? But you don't want to have something so minimum that you're not delivering anything. So like, have enough information to do the story and complete it, but not more. And then, yeah, remember the invest criteria, the stories should be small. So if you're getting into like a ton of detail and you're seeing that the acceptance criteria is getting really long, it's probably time to think about maybe splitting that story. If you really feel like all the acceptance criteria are necessary in there, it may need to be split. So just something to keep in mind. This is an easy one. True or false? User stories should be independent. So again, we live in the real world, right? And notice I said they should be independent. The question is not. User stories have to be independent. So do whatever you can do to avoid or eliminate the dependencies. But if you're not able to do that, which happens, just make sure the team is aware, everyone in the team that's going to be touching that story is aware of the dependency, and even write it in Jira so that nobody can miss it. Just say, like, we know there's this dependency, we're going to finish this, and kind of write maybe a sentence or two of how you're going to handle that dependency. All right, the last true false question. A story is small enough to be completed in a few hours. Yes. Remember, invest again. So a user story has to have value. If you can honestly implement something in a few hours, it's probably just a task. So why spend all the time doing all the things you need to do for a story? So refining, estimating, coming up with tests, and doing all those things when it really can just be a task. Do this, make sure it's done, finished. So just keep that in mind. If you can finish it in a few hours, then it's probably just a task, and just put it in Jira as a task so that you have documentation for it, get it done and finished. Okay, good. So a sample user story is like, view credit card balance. As a credit card user, I want to be able to see my balance that I owe so that I can make a payment. So here you have the who, the what, and the why. And then I want to be able to have some acceptance criteria. Given I have entered my username and password, when I click on credit card info, then I can view my total balance. So that's something completely easy that someone who's doing the testing can make an automated test case out of this. And the correct balance is shown. So like when I enter my username and password, I click on that, I can view my balance, and it's the correct balance. And the total minimum payment is shown. So like if you owe $5,000 or 5,000 euros on your credit card, but you only need to make a payment of $100 or 100 euros, then the minimum payment is shown. And the payment due date is visible. So you can see when you have to make the payment. So that all totally makes sense. And if the due date is in the past, a notification pop-up appears on the screen. So this is a good example of like, okay, you don't need to get into the details of how it looks. You can just say like, see the attachment for the format of the pop-up window and what text needs to be there. That way it's in the acceptance criteria, but you don't have to get into the details in this particular space of all the particulars that need to show up on that window. Okay, and I've added a few links here on if you want to get into a little bit more information about user stories. I just added a few things here. This last one, Dan North, is he's an excellent resource for Agile stuff, and this particular post he has is about BDD and user stories, so it's fantastic. Highly recommend. Yeah, this is a super fun topic for me. So I love user stories, and I love talking to people about them. And yeah, so I appreciate everybody joining the call, and